In this video, we're going to be showing you how to change a cat engine harness as well as a destruction of the week. So a customer brought this 3406E in for a boost pressure sensor fault. They had a check engine light and didn't know what was causing it. And you can see that the harness does not appear to be in the best condition. They had just taken it to a different shop, and that shop had replaced the boost pressure sensor. But they didn't seem to notice that the harness itself was basically trashed. And if you wiggled the harness, especially in this area right here, I'm going to show you. Look where the arrow is. If you wiggled it in this area, it would actually short out the boost pressure sensor. And did not need a new boost pressure sensor. It needed the harness replaced, which is why I'm going to be making this video. Now to do the harness, you don't need many tools. You need a pair of dikes or flush cuts, a 4mm Allen wrench bit or Allen wrench. Pretty much all the CAT ECMs use a 4mm Allen. A pick. You don't need a pick, but I like using this is a Mayhew pick, and they're pretty heavy duty. They're really good for connectors, and I like to use either some silicone lubricant or also known as dielectric grease. Now CAT actually tells you not to use this, but I don't use it on the actual connector portion. I use it on the sealing portion, and I'll talk about that later when I'm using it. Now I'm going to speed this section up here. So on your ECM, your forwardmost connector in a 70 pin is the engine side connector. So that's the harness we're going to be changing out. The rear connector is the chassis side, which is basically a Peterbilt or a Kenworth or Freightliner harness. That would be much more difficult to change out. So all you're going to do is loosen that 4mm Allen screw or bolt. And then all you're going to start doing is cutting all the zip ties holding the old harness to it. Now you don't need ET, you don't need any special training or anything to do this obviously, but it's good to know that, hey, if you do have to change your harness out, hey, here's what you're going to be in store for. And there's also two ways to do this harness. You can start on the end of the harness, which on this harness the end would be at the oil pressure and coolant temp sensor side, and then start from there and work your way back. I generally like to start at the ECM and then tackle the larger part of the harness and then work my way to the smaller side of the harness. And then really all it is simply disconnecting all the little connectors, which is not very difficult, and cutting any zip ties holding the harness to the head, the chassis harness, anything like that. And then all you're going to be doing is pulling it through. Now, if you haven't done one of these before, it's a good idea to take some pictures or at least mark something to know, hey, if you haven't done this before, kind of where the harness is routed at. And maybe the way it's currently routed isn't the best possible way. What is the best possible way? Well, you don't want the harness rubbing against anything hot, anything that vibrates a lot. I generally like to keep it next to other wires and zip tie them together. Now, this is our injector harness here. And these can be extremely difficult to remove at times. And depending on what style you have, they're typically like this with the 12-pin connector. I like to scrape all the dirt and oil that's almost always accumulated around it off. Get it as clean as possible, and then you kind of have to do like a pincer move with your fingers. And if you can get the two tabs in, you can generally work its way out. Now, depending on, some of the harness have a slot you can get to on the top and push a screwdriver in and then kind of use that as leverage to pop it out. This one, that recessed portion is actually on the bottom, so you can't do that. And you might be thinking, aren't you going to damage the harness pulling on it that hard? Well, the harness is getting replaced anyways. If you're not going to be replacing the harness, though, be very careful when pulling these out. Now, notice this is wet with engine oil. This is a problem with these internal injector harnesses. Is a wire is basically a little rubber hose with copper in it, and it'll push oil through into the main harness. You're almost always going to find oil in there, and there's not much you can do about it. If it is starting to push deep into the harness, like if you pulled that 70-pin connector off and there was oil in there, then you would want to replace the internal harness as well. Now, notice there was a little wire, this one here, that was backfed into our 70-pin there. That's not factory. Someone has ran an overlay on this harness already. We're going to be getting rid of that, obviously, with the new harness. So what we're doing now is we're just disconnecting all the other sensors. We got your fuel temp sensor, atmospheric pressure sensor, And this is the secondary timing sensor, or cam position timing sensor. And here I am using my pick for the first time. Unfortunately, this one is pretty hard to get to, and depending on when the last time the connector, if ever, was removed, it can be tricky. Now, why use a pick? Why not try to grab it with my fingers? Well, you can't really tell from the video, but I can't get my hand in there. It's practically impossible. And I found a pick in 2 different instances can really help. So you can usually hook the retaining tab, push it down and pull it back. Or if it's an amp seal style connector, which has a retaining tab on the outside, you can try to pluck the tab that holds it, which is kind of like an arm, up and then pull it back. That works really well as well. Now, if you damage the portion of the harness that you're replacing, no big deal. See, I got it there. Just kind of tight. The longer they're in there, the more dirt and oil that accumulate. It's just difficult to get to, but not as difficult as some of the other ones. Now, this is the sensor that just got replaced, and a boost pressure sensor. And unfortunately, look at that. They replaced it, but they didn't notice that there was like a butt connector already in the harness here. It kind of irritates me when people replace stuff that doesn't need replaced just because they don't want to troubleshoot properly. Now, the hardest one to get to is that one right there. Well, that's kind of a throw between this one and the coolant temp sensor. But this is definitely the nastiest. So what looks to be covered in oil, dirt, grime is definitely covered in oil, dirt, and grime. And that is our crank position sensor. We're going to get back to that, but just want to show you where there's the oil pressure and then the coolant temp. I pulled the coolant temp one already off camera, and that's where the overlay was going that I was talking about earlier. Someone, as you could see, it already overlaid that, and I had removed all the connectors except for one. And that one was the one that was the most nastiest and hardest to get to, which is on the C15 at 34.6Es, the crank position sensor. Now, the reason these are usually this nasty, this is not uncommon, they're almost always like this, is a couple reasons actually, but generally the most common reason is the front structure's leaking, or the air compressor's leaking, or the power steering pump's leaking, and it just over time just accumulates oil here, which then gets road grime on it and dirt, and it just makes this connector really nasty. This is getting a little tedious, so I'm going to speed it up significantly by about 300% here. And it was really difficult to get out. So what happens is all that dirt gets generally behind the tab, and then when you try to push the tab down, it won't go down all the way, and it just won't pop out. And the dirt kind of turns into like some sort of a wet, oily cement as well. So yeah, it's you really got to work it. Try not to break the sensor though, or else you're going to be having an even worse day. So was I able to get it out? Yes, I was. So once it was out, I generally like to go over the harness and sometimes keep some of the connectors, especially the 2 and 3 pin connectors. Here's where that overlay was. And if they're in good condition. I also like to inspect to see if there's any other damage that I didn't see. And this one was in pretty bad shape. You could probably keep this connector if you wanted. That's a Deutsch style connector. Very common. Yeah, it's always good to have a couple. I have a lot more than a couple extra ones. That's where it was rubbed through. You could see it was in really bad shape. And that main center section here had not been zip tied, so it was probably rubbing against the block. And that's what happens over time. Here's our friend, the crank position sensor. You can see its bare wires there as well. Butt connectors, completely broken off, and bare wires as well. So Cat does not make the best of everything. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. However, I would make an argument that their filters are really good, and they probably make the best, at least, engine harnesses. The engine harnesses use either Deutsch or amp seal connectors, which use the same style pins and sockets. They are generally a thick wire. They use a nice loom. It's not just split loom, it's this webbing loom there. It's pretty resilient. These harnesses last a while. I like the Cat harnesses. Not only that, they come with little tags on them that tell you where they go. Now, unless you know which sensor is which, it doesn't really help anyway, but you can kind of figure it out. Generally, A temp sensor is going to have 2 pins, and a pressure sensor is going to have 3 pins. Now, remember I said I like to use dielectric heat. This is where I use it on, just on the seal. I'm not spreading it all over the connector. I'm not putting it in the pins or the sockets. I really only put it on the seals, and if you start using it on the seals, you'll be surprised how easily they go together. Now, notice this. This is a torque wrench. 53 inch-pounds is what that is torque to. Do not over torque that. You can break the ECM or the new harness connector or the bolt. You don't want to do that. Now that's a little tab that goes on the bottom on this one. Sometimes they go on the top. And then you want to push it in until it clicks. And I'd sprayed this connector off with brake clean, the old part for the internal harness. And then really all you're going to be doing is installing your new harness into the new connectors. Now, I'm not going to show me installing every single connector together. I just basically want you to see that it's pretty easy. It's pretty plug and play. Most people could change a harness themselves. You do not need to hire a mechanic to do it. Here's our friend, the crank position sensor. Now, notice I brake cleaned off this area a little bit as well. A little less filthy now. I didn't want to get the new harness as dirty. Now, it is still fairly dirty. You'd have to steam clean this off quite a while to get it really clean. But that one's in. Now, really all you're going to do is once everything's plugged in, if you do have access to CAT ET, you can see I got my new oil pressure sensor here, or oil pressure plugged in. Now, I did notice this. This is not part of our harness. The pyrometer is basically, the threads are gone. It's just sitting in there. But we do have ET on this one. And what I was going to do is just go through and clear all the old faults, which you should do if you've fixed it. And it's good if you have ET to make sure before you zip tie everything in place, once everything's plugged in, that you don't have any voltage high or voltage low codes. That would indicate that there's a problem either with the new harness, or you plug something in the wrong place, or a sensor has been damaged while doing this job. Okay, so we have verified that no check engine lights, that's good. Now this is a pair of flush cuts. Flush cuts is how you should be cutting zip ties. Now, if you're going to be removing them, you can use any pair of dikes or flush cuts, whatever. But when you install zip ties, you should be using flush cuts because it leaves no sharp edges on the zip tie once it's cut. And I'll put a link in the description to my recommended tools. Time for a little destruction of the week. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's a dozer. That dozer had a little problem in one of the final drives here. Yeah, those used to be gear teeth, but they don't seem to be doing very much anymore. Those teeth definitely need a dental plan. The main gear here also trashed, and a little bit of metal residue left over in the housing. Hope you guys enjoy. Thanks for watching.